This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, Merry Christmas, everybody. And/or Happy Holidays, if Merry Christmas is still too politically incorrect to say in 2024. You know, I have noticed that even Starbucks is bringing back the Merry Christmas coffee cups. So it's either a cold day in hell or a lot of this woke culture BS is finally being done away with. But whether you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you happen to celebrate during the holiday season, I hope you're all well rested. Hope you're enjoying time with friends and family. If you are watching this podcast on Friday, I hope you're ready for another installment of Classic Wrestling Talk. And you are in for a special one today because we got Starrcade 88 on the docket. We've also got world-class and Midsouth television to cover. It is going to be a full-length Friday episode this week. Glad I had plenty of time to sit down and thoroughly take the time to watch all these shows, because it's always one of my biggest fears when I get behind schedule. You know, it's not just a matter of me watching the shows, but also trying to stay focused and make sure I'm not missing anything important. Some weeks are better than others. That's all I could say. Depends on how much sleep I get. But there is a lot to get into with this Starrcade pay-per-view, so we will get going with things and try to dive into these recaps. By the way, make sure you subscribe if you have not already. You can find the Five Starr Wrestling Report on YouTube and Rumble Mondays and Fridays every week. We have one more podcast left in the year, and that'll be this coming Monday. That'll be our annual Year in Review special podcast, where we take a look back and I give you some of my thoughts on the current state of the wrestling product in 2024. I'll also have my top 10 matches to go over. I got that all in the can and ready to go for Monday. So make sure you stop by to hear my thoughts on all that. In terms of the wrestling TV and pay-per-view coverage, this is going to be our final one to close out the year 2024. So I will do my best to make it entertaining. No promises. But here we are. NWA Starrcade. The very first Starrcade under the official WCW banner. It is still kind of awkward trying to train myself to run with the tagline of these Starrcade events. True grit. With 2 T's. Because I guess 2 T's makes it grittier. Even though, ironically enough, grittier is spelled with 2 T's. Now, of course, if you've been following along with the Saturday TBS reviews, you know, we've talked about the journey of them actually arriving at the Starrcade card with everything that's happened post-Bash season. We are about a month officially removed from the sale to the Turner Network. The negotiation process had dated pretty much all the way back to early September, but they only really finalized everything probably the first week or two of November. And we have started to see a few new production changes in just the last couple of weeks on the studio shows. We've seen them noticeably cut back on a lot of the promo time. They started running more with these inset picture-in-picture icons with the guys doing promos mid-matches. And, well, then they would just kind of cut back to the match or whatever. We've also seen a lot of fluctuation with feuds and programs that were either started and unfinished, or things that looked like they were going in one direction and then they shifted gears and went a completely different way. Whether that's Bam Bam teasing a feud with Ric Flair for the world's heavyweight title that, to this day, I still have no idea if those two ever wrestled a match. It's so weird. You know, they were out there cutting promos on each other for weeks, and then, well, then they went with Luger instead. Which meant that they had to pull Luger from the feud with the Road Warriors in order to replace him with Dusty as Sting's partner. That way they could do Bam Bam and Barry Windham for the U.S. heavyweight title instead of Barry and Dusty. And of course, Dusty and Sting wound up facing the Road Warriors for the tag straps on this card instead. Just, yeah, a lot of oddball, quirky decisions they've made in terms of restructuring a lot of these main event feuds. And not to mention there was a whole thing with Tully and Arn leaving unexpectedly, completely dismantling the feud they had started with the Midnight Express, which is how we ended up getting Paulie and the original Midnights coming in. And, you know, we also talked about the decision of pushing Starrcade back to December as opposed to running a Thanksgiving week like it traditionally had been. And it was still considered a relative success when you look back at the pay-per-view buys and the attendance figures. And I'm usually not somebody to get hung up on that kind of stuff, but this was a drastic change when you consider it was their decision to run their biggest event a month later. It's kind of the equivalent to WWE trying to run WrestleMania in, say, late May or early June. So when you look back and you see that it still did 150,000 buys, and they still managed to pack about 10,000 people in the Norfolk scope for the event, the change really didn't negatively affect the pay-per-view numbers like I think a lot of skeptics would have thought. And the other thing, too, and this is where the retrospective reviews really come in handy when we sit here and compare things year over year, perhaps one of the biggest motives for them pushing Starrcade to December in 1988. Remember, just a year prior, they tried to run Starrcade 87 opposite the very first Survivor Series, and it was an absolute disaster for the NWA. And because it was already established by this point that Survivor Series was going to be an annual thing, and not to mention everything Vince tried to do to sabotage Crockett with going to the cable providers and threatening to pull out both Survivor Series and WrestleMania 4 if they didn't cut ties running Starrcade opposite them. So you also had that to consider when you're thinking, well, Christ, how do we counteract that next year? Knowing that Vince basically has a captive clutch on the cable providers. Still, though, you know, it's a time when wrestling drew exponentially well during the holiday season. And obviously with them being in Norfolk, it was nice seeing Magnum TA there with Tony Schiavone as one of the talking heads. The hometown hero, so to speak. I mean, I know we say it like every time he pops up on screen, but it's still a damn shame when you look back and see that Magnum never really made a proper comeback to the business since the auto accident in '86. And I think even around this point, people were still holding out hope. But it was still good to have him as part of the show. You know, overall, you had 7 main card matches plus the Bunkhouse Battle Royal, which they aired as a dark match after the main event. But they still managed to keep the pay-per-view around the 3-hour mark. All the matches, I thought, got the appropriate amount of time. You know, there was a logical, coherent structure to how all these matches were placed and flowed on the card. And we'll dive into the specifics as we talk about each individual segment. I just kind of know for a lot of people out there, Starrcade 88 was kind of viewed as the last Crockett holdover show where, you know, even though Crockett didn't necessarily run the day-to-day operations anymore, you still had the fingerprints of the old Crockett regime hanging around. The talent being booked on the card, wrapping up feuds they had previously started from the Bash. You know, it hadn't completely devolved into the Jim Herd nightmare quite yet. technically, even by this point, I don't even think Jim Herd was there yet. At least not full time. I might have to recheck my resources there, but my understanding is that Jim didn't really come into the forefront until like the first week of January. But even on this pay-per-view, everything being presented was still serious to a degree. And, we'll see how the WWF influence starts to overtake a lot of these WCW shows as we move into 89 and, Christ, especially the early 90s. But they opened with the U.S. Heavyweight Tag Title match between the Fantastics and the Varsity Club. Specifically Kevin Sullivan and Dr. Death, since Mike Rotunda was defending the TV title against Rick Steiner later on. Williams had become the newest affiliate to the Varsity Club in a mysterious off-screen angle that they never aired on television or bothered to explain. Like one day Dr. Death just showed up at the studio alongside the Varsity Club and was like, "Surprise, motherfucker. I'm a bad guy now." No explanation to how he joined the group. He was just there. And, obviously the Fantastics are fresh off winning the belts at the previous Clash of Champions. They beat Eddie Gilbert and Ron Simmons in the finals of the tournament after the Midnight Express had vacated the belts. And we talked a lot about this in the weeks leading up to Starrcade. Hypothetically, they could have put the straps on either team at the Clash, since it was a babyface match anyway. Because the end result was always for them to get the belts on the Varsity Club. Fulton and Rogers, they're basically gone from the company within the first couple months of 89. I think their very last televised match was the Clash in February. Then I think they left for Japan or something. Looking back, they just needed a credible babyface team to drop the belts to the Varsity Club. Oh, by the way, one thing I didn't talk about here, I mentioned Tony Schiavone and Magnum TA. The actual commentary team for the event was Jim Ross and Bob Caudle. Absolutely one of my favorite announce team combinations. Those two are so great together on the headset. And truly one of those very underappreciated commentary duos that people do not talk about often enough. I love those two working together. In terms of the action here, I thought the match was pretty good. Predictable outcome aside, and there was still a lot of ebb and flow in the match. It was a hot opener that kept moving. Crowd was engaged. And they really popped for the big moments, especially when the Fantastics were in control of everything. There was a spot in this match that kind of made me cock my head sideways a little bit. I can't even necessarily call it a hot tag fake out, because usually that would insinuate there was some kind of false tag, where the babyface goes to make the hot tag, but the illegal partner on the apron gets pulled away or something, or the legal partner gets intercepted before the tag. Neither of those two things happen here. Tommy Rogers manages to tag in Bobby Fulton after Tommy had been previously worked over for several minutes to, try to break free from the heels. So Bobby gets in there, tries to go after Sullivan to start the babyface flurry. And it basically amounts to both guys no-selling each other's eye-gouging attempts. And then Sullivan just kicks Fulton in the stomach and immediately stops his momentum. I was like, did that not make Bobby Fulton look like the world's biggest geek? What the hell was Sullivan doing here? He deliberately no-sold Bobby Fulton's comeback. For no reason. It's not even like he let Fulton get in a few hope spots before he cut him off. Sullivan was just like, nope, fuck you, dude. And they started taking turns beating up Bobby Fulton for several minutes. And that was really the only thing that stood out in this match. The one point where I'm just like, what exactly went on there? Was there just a blatant miscommunication between both teams where one guy wanted to start an early comeback, but the other guy didn't want to start feeding? It was very weird. Again, people were very much into the Fantastics. Can never overstate that enough. Admittedly, the finish was a little clunky. Looking back, I think that's kind of what they were going for. It looked like they were trying to do the pinfall spot where the babyface goes to kick out before 3, but he's just a hair too late before the official counts his shoulders down. It was just odd, though, because Bobby was totally in control of Steve Williams when he was raining down punches in the corner. And then Rogers and Sullivan start going at it. You see Dr. Death drape Fulton over the top rope with the Eddie Gilbert stun gun. And it basically renders Bobby Fulton dead. Because then Williams just gets on top of him and pins him 1, 2, 3. I think it fell a little flat. Simply because of the fact that, they try to have Bobby kick out at like 3.1. But it still kind of looked like he kicked out well before Teddy's hand came down for the third fall. So the fans are sitting there thinking, the hell? Well, that's kind of bull. Yeah, the crowd absolutely did not like that finish. They booed that shit out of the building. But the end result was exactly what needed to happen. You turn Dr. Death heel. It is candidly one of the first major pushes they've ever given him in the NWA outside the sporadic on and off appearances he made throughout 87. He got him aligned with one of the top heel groups, taking the former place of Rick Steiner. This was a big moment for his career. God, definitely a vast improvement from what they had him do in the previous Starrcade, when he wrestled that completely nothing happening match with Barry Windham for the UWF title that nobody gave a fuck about. I think the match went like 5 minutes and change. Most of you probably don't even remember that. It was so unmemorable. So this kind of helped Dr. Death get back off the ground. As we'll see later on in 89, they got some even bigger plans for him and Rotunda in the tag division. And so that brings us to the Midnights versus Original Midnights tag match. I believe the only time in history where a grown man in glittery red tuxedo pants could challenge another man to a fight. And I buy that the guy in the red tuxedo pants could still believably kick the other guy's ass. That shows how much of a weasel Paul Lee was. It's always going to be one of those things with the Midnight versus Midnight feud. Because they scrapped so much of this program before it ever really had a chance to fully take off in 89, I think you're always going to look back at this feud in a similar way you kind of look back at the Midnight's Horseman feud. It's a big what if. What if they'd have stuck the course and Crockett didn't get so caught up in his personal vendetta with Randy Rose's work? How far would they have gone with everything? And yeah, the feud in a lot of ways was more built about the issue between the managers than the talents necessarily. And we do eventually get the blow-off way later on in 89 when they finally do the tuxedo match with Corny and Heyman at the Bash. It just sucks because the match they had here was pretty good. It's not my favorite Midnight Express match of all time, but you think, as a first act or a first chapter in trying to get the story going and push things forward into 89, they did just enough in this match to give you a suitable payoff for the heat they had previously built up on television when the OG Midnights came up and bloodied up Cornette in front of the world, beating down Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane. But at the same time, they didn't go balls to the walls and break out every gigantic high spot in the world. And that's why the finish of this works so well. Because even though Jim Cornette's Midnight Express won, the original Midnights were able to get some of their heat back in the afterbirth. Of course, even by this point, the idea was to continue the next chapter of the feud into 89. But then as we would come to learn, The blow-off doesn't necessarily happen as intended. And while the story to the match wasn't overly complex, you had the early stuff where Corny was whipping Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose with his racket behind Teddy Long's back. And yeah, he's technically a babyface in the scope of what they're doing here in this match. But it's also not entirely out of the realm of what you would expect a guy like JC to do, given his history of underhanded tactics. And while Bobby and Stan have everything in their control for practically the first half of the match, you get to the spot where beautiful Bobby accidentally crotches himself in the corner trying to take out Randy. The heels are able to turn things in their favor and get their opportunity to work over Bobby for the heat. I mean, really one of the first times we've seen a true babyface in peril Bobby Eaton on a major stage. Even when he was in there wrestling Ric Flair and Barry Wynn in the previous month at the Clash, they didn't work any extensive heat angles on Bobby like Dennis and Randy were doing here. But it worked. It was all great. And you eventually get Stan getting in there and doing the thing Stan Lane does best. Choppy-looking karate kicks and gyrating his testicles in front of God and everybody. It is still a family show. Which in turn leads to everything breaking down where everybody's in the ring brawling. And while Corny's going after Heyman on the floor, Teddy sees the giant cell phone in the ring that Heyman used on Stan Lane a minute prior. So there's a big controversy where the OG Midnights are pleading their case that they didn't use the phone. And it's all a giant distraction so Bobby and Stan can hit their double goozle on Randy and secure the pinfall. But like I said, Dennis, Randy, and Paulie are right there after the bell to jump the Midnights and get some of their heat back. So, again, you could see even by this point, they were still looking to continue the feud forward. And it's not my favorite Midnight Express match I've ever seen. But they left us on a high note when the pay-per-view had ended. It's just the afterbirth where they dropped the ball considerably. But we'll get into the logistics of that as we cover the 89 timeline. So then we had Ivan Koloff and Junkyard Dog versus the Russian Assassins. With the stipulation, if the Assassins lose, not only do they have to unmask, but Paul Jones will also be stripped of his managerial license. He will have to retire from the NWA, at least as an on-screen personality. And, kind of going back to the subject of them having to radically change plans with the storyline. Remember, JYD was not even supposed to be a part of this match. It was supposed to be Ivan and Nikita facing the Assassins. But shortly before the Clash in December, Nikita walked out with zero notice. So they had to try and come up with some surface-level rationale for JYD coming in to team up with his fellow Soviet comrade, Ivan Koloff. Because we all know that dog has a soft spot for the Soviets. Ask Nikolai Volkov and Crusher Darso about that. So with that in mind, I guess we can get the obvious talking point out of the way. Yes, the match absolutely sucked ass. But if I'm being fair, it only sucked ass for about 6.5 minutes. It did hit me too watching this. Totally random thought. This is our third straight match in the pay-per-view where the only thing we've seen are tag matches. Because again, this was still back when tag team wrestling was actually valued. God, think about that by today's standards. When's the last time you saw a wrestling card where you had 3 straight back-to-back-to-back regular tag matches that weren't just multi-man clusterfucks with guys nobody cares about? Like, actual clear-cut tag matches with feuds and stories that they spent time building up. That's almost unheard of. Now, again, given this wasn't the initial plan for the Koloff Assassin feud, Dog Sword got roped into this last minute because they were desperate to find Ivan a replacement partner. And also accounting for the fact that this is JYD circa 1988. We weren't exactly getting peak or prime Junkyard Dog by this point. He was out of shape, very clearly unmotivated, still beat up physically from all that travel schedule over the years. It wasn't Mid-South JYD from 1981 or 1982. We'll just leave it at that. And the other thing, because they were spending so much effort hinting at the idea that this was going to be Paul Jones's last big hoorah, when the Assassins actually went over, I was like, hold on, what? The fuck? Seriously, I had completely forgotten that the Russian Assassins won this match. Could have fooled me. Apparently they keep this gimmick around well into the early stages of '89. I totally wiped that from memory. I thought this was one of the last on-screen appearances we would ever get from Paul Jones. Nah, it turns out he's sticking around a while longer. I know Ivan's wrapping up pretty soon. Looking at my notes here, there really wasn't a whole lot to talk about aside from the finish, where you get Paul Jones helping one of the Assassins load his mask on the floor, and while Teddy's distracted dealing with other shit happening in the ring, you get this really weird setup where Ivan's got the other assassin covered in a pin attempt. The gimmicked assassin runs in and headbutts Ivan to break up the pin. And then, for no discernible reason other than the fact that Teddy Long's a fucking Nimrod, he sees the illegal assassin go over to cover Ivan's dead body, and he counts the 3 anyway. Were we supposed to believe that Teddy got confused on which assassin was which? Because if so, they probably needed to set that up better. Because he was looking directly at both fucking Russian assassins when he went to count that fall. What was so confusing about it? You literally saw the illegal assassin come in and cover Ivan when the other assassin was still laying flat on his back. Unless Teddy Long was blind and or mentally deficient, something ain't adding up there, brother. That was a huge blunder. But again, dude, look at the talent involved. Yes, you had guys like Ivan and Paul, who we all knew were good friends with Jim Crockett. But where are most of these guys by February or March of next year? Ivan's pretty much done by early '89. The Assassins have to wrap up their stuff pretty soon. Paul, same deal. And I don't even think JYD lasts another month before he gets fired for no-showing a live event. Or maybe it was a February Clash, I don't even remember. I think it's fair to look back at this match and just call it like it is. It was a dud. It was the Jimmy Valiant Paul Jones feud of 1986 on the Starrcade card. The prime example of, hey, Jimmy Crockett needs to give his buddy some pay-per-view spots, so what campy story can we come up with for Paul Jones to give him something to do? Why not? Let's have him manage a pair of fake Russians under masks. And that leads us to the Mike Rotunda Rick Steiner TV title match, with Kevin Sullivan suspended above the ring in a shark cage. I will try to refrain from my usual complaint about my hatred for shark cage gimmicks. The most palpable argument being, why not just bar the other teammates from ringside? Especially when you know for a fact that Dr. Death is going to somehow get involved. There was something oddly humorous to me about seeing Sullivan get hoisted above the ring in the cage while they were still playing the Syracuse fight song over the speakers. And, oh, good Lord, speaking of that cage, had a great shot from the hard cam side where the geniuses decided, let's put the shark cage directly in front of the main shot so it blocks the entire fucking view of the ring. Absolute brilliance. Thankfully, they didn't film the entire match from the hard cam perspective. God, I'm still amazed that Rotunda was only 29 years old when this match happened. That made me feel old. Well, when it comes to the match, pretty much the whole show, as a matter of fact, the single crowd favorite going in. The guy fans wanted to see more than anybody else on the card. Head and shoulders above everybody else. Rick Steiner. Not even close. This is the culmination to months and months of faction warfare, bullying and hazing. All those times we saw Steiner get disrespected by Rotunda and Sullivan on television. We knew it was only a matter of time before finally Steiner lost his cool and stood up for himself. Like, even before the match, when they had that pre-taped interview in the locker room with Magnum and the Varsity Club, and you still had Sullivan and Rotunda being overconfident jocks, calling Steiner a stupid dog, saying that Rotunda's going to wipe the floor with him, blah, blah. That was always the story going in. That Rick Steiner is such a half-wit, the only possible way that he beats Mike Rotunda is via slip on a banana peel finish. Which, spoiler, it's exactly how it went down. And that's perfectly okay. Because the fans were not going to accept any other result. They could have tried to find a million different ways to fuck Steiner in the end. Had he not left Norfolk as the new TV champion, I legitimately think the company would have ensued a riot. It would have gotten that out of hand. The wrong kind of heat. And while I wouldn't really say the match was perfect, again, because Rick Steiner was so over with the crowd, the quality of the match never mattered. It wasn't the most exciting match in the world. I think a lot of modern fans watching it would probably argue it went way too long, which, I mean, maybe. There were a few downtime periods where I thought, maybe they could have shaved off a few minutes of heat. But it's not like I was sitting there begging for them to take the match home. I did like the spot where the fans started chanting retardo and Mike. And then Mike threatened to walk out, complaining to Teddy that the fans were bothering him. As if Teddy were fucking HR. Like, what was he going to do? Turn to the crowd and be like, hey, cut it out. It's not nice. Of course, we laugh about it in 1988. I mean, you wouldn't even think twice about hearing those kind of chants in today's culture. You'd have the ring announcers getting on the house mic telling the fans to stop being disrespectful. The big turning point here is when Steiner starts rallying his babyface comeback. It was right after Steiner had taken that wicked bump out to the floor and landed right on the concrete like a fucking pancake. Even JR nearly crapped his pants seeing that. But as Steiner's fighting back, you see Dr. Death just casually start meandering down to ringside. And it's funny because he wasn't even casually speed walking to make it look urgent. He's just sauntering down to ringside, thinking apparently nobody would notice his giant behemoth. And what was the purpose of Dr. Death coming out? He was there to ring the bell. Let me repeat that. He took almost 2 full minutes to walk down to ringside, not to feed Rotunda a gimmick or help him cheat to pin Steiner. Their game plan was for Dr. Death to ring the bell as a distraction spot. So I guess Teddy would get confused as to whether or not the match was a time expiration. And so that leads to the whole confusion where Teddy thinks the match is over, but senior referee Tom Young runs down to inform him that Dr. Death came out to ring the bell behind his back. Again, I still laugh at the whole concept that Teddy never saw Dr. Death come out. Like he was a fucking ghost or something. I mean, it only took him 8 goddamn years to get all the way down to ringside just to do that spot. So again, the fans are thinking Steiner's about to get screwed, but then Teddy restarts the match as they're letting Sullivan out of the cage. And amidst all the commotion, Steiner ducks a charge from Rotunda, who inadvertently bumps into Sullivan. And then Steiner just leaps on top of Rotunda and pins him 1, 2, 3. I believe I wrote here. Yeah. Rotunda is pinned via knocking himself unconscious by hitting another wrestler. You don't see that too often. The hell was Kevin Sullivan made of? Lead? I mean, it was kind of funny. But my fucking God, what a pop. When Steiner pinned Rotunda and won the TV belt, that freaking pop, dude. That was one of the biggest reactions I've heard on any sanctioned NWA event in 1988. These people went ballistic for Steiner at the end. There was not a single person, man, woman, or child in their seat. I'm telling you, you'd have thought he just pinned Ric Flair in the main event for the world title. That's how over this guy was. It was astounding. And like you think about it, on the totem pole of NWA championships, I mean, let's be honest, where does the TV title rank in terms of importance? Maybe second from the bottom? Right above the 6-man championships? Or the Western States Heritage Championship? These people didn't give a shit. For them, the belt was just a consolation prize. They were just happy to see Steiner get revenge on these jock-sniffing assholes. It was great. Steiner taking that victory lap around the ring, pointing and laughing at the heels for getting outsmarted. What more could you ask for? That is perfect pro wrestling, dude. One of the highlights of the show, bar none. And while I am on the subject of this is unfortunately one of those old-time wrestling allegories that we've heard passed down over the years. I don't know how much of it is true versus how much of it's fabricated. Because of the fact that we're watching these NWA shows in real time, I am hesitant to drink the Kool-Aid just because a lot of it really doesn't make contextual sense when you think about it. The whole rumor about the original plans for the main event of Starrcade 88 supposedly being Ric Flair and Rick Steiner for the World Heavyweight title in what was supposed to apparently be like a 5-minute squash. Okay, first off, let me say this. I don't buy the 5-minute squash thing at all. I think that was something that got totally blown out of proportion. But I don't even know if I buy the idea that before everything fell through with Dusty as the booker, they were actually considering putting the world title on Rick Steiner on this show. I mean, could they have done it? Yeah. It would have made zero sense from a storyline standpoint, considering they spent the better half of 3 months building up Steiner's split from the Varsity Club? Like, how in the world were they going to go from that to putting Steiner in the main event of Starrcade to beat Flair for the world title with less than 4 months build? mean, that would have been hotshot booking that I don't even think Dusty would have been sold on. And like my whole understanding of it was that because Rhodes and Flair weren't really on good terms right before Rhodes' departure, he was trying to look for some last-minute ploy to fuck Flair out of the belt or something like that. Again, there's so much that doesn't add up when you think about the timeline of the fall season. If you were going to put the world title on Steiner, then he should have split from the Varsity Club as far back as the Great American Bash. Because that way he could have wrapped up his issues with Sullivan and Rotunda before they try to give him the rocket ship thrust of the world title picture. Again, it doesn't make sense to me. The whole gossip about the original plans for Flair at Starrcade 88. Nevertheless, this Rotunda Steiner blow-off absolutely worked. Easily one of the biggest crowd responses for anything on the entire show. And then up next, we had Barry Windham defending the U.S. Heavyweight title against Bam Bam Bigelow. I've been trying to come up with a word to describe this match. I don't want to use the term forgettable because that usually implies it was kind of mediocre in execution. It was by no means a bad match. People were actually really into it, surprisingly. And the work here was very good, which I think was a real testament to how talented Barry Windham was in the ring. I think it's just one of those unfortunate middle-of-the-card title defenses that gets lost in the shuffle over time. It wasn't one of Barry Windham's better career matches. Wasn't even really one of Bam Bam's better career matches. I mean, what they did together here was solid. I don't really know what it was, but something seemed off about it. Maybe it was the predictability of Barry retaining. Maybe it was the fact that it seemed like a little bit of a downgrade for Bam Bam when they spent all those weeks teasing a feud between him and Flair for the World Heavyweight title. And keep in mind, too, this is literally coming off the heels of that Ric Flair, Barry Windham versus Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane match at the Clash. That was a tough one to follow. The other thing, too, and I think we briefly touched on this when Bam Bam and Oliver Humperdinck showed up in the NWA a few months ago. Bam Bam was around for what? A couple months? Then he left and went back to Japan, I think. And obviously he came back to WCW later in '89. I think towards the tail end of the year, right before he went back to the WWF. I don't know if they ever figured him into any bigger plans with the new regime. I mean, considering he left shortly after this pay-per-view, my bet would be no. Elsewise, he'd have stuck around longer. This was always just a weird program for me. It's hard to even explain. But again, that's not discounting the work. Because the match was good. Yeah, they're both bigger guys, but they're also considerably great athletes. So they can actually move around and take big bumps. Especially by the end. They were sweating like they'd just worked an hour Broadway with each other. There was a spot where Bam Bam got dumped out to the floor and started selling the knee. Led to him missing a big splash on Barry because he was too slow to recover. Barry had the claw on Bam Bam for a while before he also went up and missed a big diving elbow. And they both spill over the top rope to the floor. Somehow nobody died on the landing, which was a miracle of faith. And you get the deal where they both struggle to beat the 10 count. But Barry manages to get back in just before Bam Bam. So Barry retains on a count out. Probably not the most glimmering finish in the world, but I didn't really have a problem with it. The count-out finish made it kind of seem like there were at least initial plans to keep the feud going. So maybe they were still banking on Bam Bam sticking around into early 89 to possibly wrap up the feud. But that's all I really had for it. Other thing to consider, too, we talked about Bam Bam leaving WCW after Starrcade. Barry, too. I mean, he's around for, another few months before he goes to work for Vince? It's easy to forget that he already had one foot out the door by this point as well. The conversation goes back to that Crockett holdover talent. The guys who were around during the prime years of television. Barry's another one. Before I talk about the next match, I have to briefly mention a few things about this Magnum TA Rick Steiner interview. Of course, we all know that trying to interview Rick Steiner is like pulling a fat guy out of a mud pit. It's going to be a struggle no matter how you spin it. But it was still train wreck awesome. Magnum is desperately trying to get Steiner's thoughts on becoming the new TV champion. The best moment in the whole thing, Magnum goes, "Well, Rick, you're going to have a lot of people gunning for you now that you're the new champion." And Rick stops and goes, "Who?" Magnum responds, "A lot of people, Rick. They're going to want a title shot." Rick just goes, "When?" And it is at that point where you see Magnum visibly start cracking up. He's just trying to finish whatever thought he has. He goes, "Very soon, Rick." Rick pauses. Then he nonchalantly goes, "Whatever, I'll beat him." The best. I just love how laid back Rick Steiner is. It's not just the idea that he's totally oblivious to the fact that he actually has to defend his belt. It's the fact that despite that he has no idea who those challengers might end up being, he's still confident that he'll beat them. And you know what? I do not doubt Rick Steiner for a minute. His first opponent could have been Abdullah the Butcher. I'd have still bet money Rick Steiner would have kicked his ass. Well, I knew this was going to be a rough one to talk about. The Road Warriors in their World Tag Team title defense with Dusty Rhodes and Sting. The final big match for Dusty Rhodes in the NWA. His swan song of sorts. And, not one that I'm sure he was happy about going in. And really, that is kind of the fundamental story of the whole thing, isn't it? The fact that Big Dust had no incentive to really try here, much less cooperate with his opponents. I mean, he knew he was gone by this point. He could have just gone out there and laid an egg, and what the fuck is management going to do about it? But credit to him. He was a professional. He showed up and did his thing, to the chagrin of a lot of fans. And that was another thing that really stood out in this match. The crowd, man. They were not in Dusty's camp. They loved Sting. They even popped for some of the stuff the Road Warriors did. But when it came time for Dusty to flip-flop and fly, when he was milking his comeback moments and trying to rally up the crowd, the response was telling. It was very lukewarm. And obviously I knew about the Dusty rejection around this point. The fact that the fans were kind of getting sick of him. But it's weird because we haven't really seen that feedback reflected on the studio shows in Atlanta. By and large, Dusty's still very much over with the studio crowd. But I think a lot of these different mid-Atlantic markets paint a different picture. It's kind of giving you a new perception that people were that sick of Dusty. His popularity was waning. Even at the point he was about to leave. And to be honest, there was already so much wrong with this match to begin with. The lack of enthusiasm for Dusty, the Road Warriors selling and having to work as heels, Sting just kind of being a body on this card instead of having a true featured match to help keep his reputation going. Everything about this just didn't click from the onset. And not that I'm trying to skip ahead to the finish and disregard everything that happened in the previous 10 or so minutes. But doing a DQ finish like that when you literally just did a count out in the previous match, it was just so flat. And not to mention the idea of seeing the Road Warriors getting visually pinned. The only reason they get saved is because of Precious Paul's interference. This just had no chance of working. It was damned from the beginning. Even before the spike angle on television that essentially cost Dusty his booking job. It all dates back to the Road Warriors turning on Sting in that 6-man tag. That was a kiss of death. Once they tried to get the fans to boo the Road Warriors, it completely derailed their momentum. And thank God Sting recovered from it. But he was in a no-win situation here. You want to talk about them needing to reshuffle the card around. If they'd have put Bam Bam in this match instead of doing him and Barry Windham for the U.S. title, and they would have done Sting and Barry Windham for the U.S. title, now that at least would have been a hot match. But I always look back at this tag and think, complete misuse of talent with some of the worst back-assward psychology imaginable. Then we had the main event for the World's Heavyweight Championship. The rematch from Baltimore. Luger's second chance at redemption against the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And, remember, they included the stipulation here that if Flair got himself intentionally disqualified or counted out, the belt would automatically switch hands and be awarded to Luger. Is the rematch that I don't think a whole lot of people were asking for, but damn it, they were going to get it anyway. Even though the bloom had long since been pulled off the rose with the Flair-Luger program. And again, I don't want to belabor the story because we've covered so much of it on the TBS reviews. I'm still of the belief that they fucked up by not putting the belt on Luger at the Great American Bash when they should have. Instead they went with that rotten ref stoppage finish because of Luger bleeding. Completely cut his balls out from under him. To the point where they basically dropped everything with him and Flair for months. And he kind of just forgot about the whole feud entirely. And Luger was already kind of having trouble capturing the attention of the fan base. He wasn't a natural personality on camera like a Sting or a Rick Steiner. He didn't have it. He looked great physically, which is always his strongest attribute. But for a guy like Luger to stay over after everything we saw go down with him over the summer, he needed to spend the next 6 months firing up on Flair any chance he got. Not coming out to the studio in suits or button-ups talking about how serious he is and how he's destined to become the world heavyweight champion. It was just too square. It was the one time where Luger needed to rip his fucking shirt off. And he kept it on every week. Looking beyond all that, I always thought Luger and Flair had really great chemistry together. I would not say the matches were ever as good as, say, Sting and Flair or even Windham and Flair. But they still had their go-to spots, things the audience would pop for, and things that they could do separate from the Sting-Windham matches. And of course, fans would react to everything that Luger did, if he was no-selling the chops and firing back on Flair. I did like hearing JR refer to Luger's pectoral development. Had to get very specific with the way Luger was training his upper body, as opposed to just saying, he does a lot of bench presses. They talked about Luger cutting weight for this match, saying he weighed in at 262, which was considerably down from where he usually weighs in, somewhere around 270, 272. He did look a lot leaner here, and he was also very tanned, almost brown. And, of course, when you're talking about a Ric Flair match, you know what you're in for. The genius of Rick as a worker is that he spent 40-plus years doing the same match over and over again, and it always worked. Never had to change a fucking thing, including him taking military presses off the top rope. God, he was still doing that shit back in TNA when he was coked out of his fucking mind. Guy's nuts. But they still played to Luger's strengths, and that's why the match was great. I mean, arguably better than the one they had in July. Even if I was more invested in the first one. And even though it's a lot of Flair selling and bumping around to try to make Luger look like God, he still had enough up and down throughout the match so people could rally behind Luger to see him make a comeback. I wrote here, Flair grabs Luger's package during a delayed vertical. That caught my eye. I think I know what I'm referencing there. There was a spot where Luger went to suplex Flair from the apron, and you could see Flair sticking his hand down the crotch area of Luger's trunks and trying to help him balance himself out. Now that is when you know you have somebody's trust. When you're a heterosexual male allowing another heterosexual male to grab your junk in order to assist in a wrestling move. By the way, completely unrelated side note. Can we talk for a minute how great Tommy Young was? He was so fantastic. Always in the right place. Knew exactly how to intervene and when to. You do not see referees like him anymore. Certainly ones that are competent. And, you have to consider the match went about a half hour, so there are a lot of peaks and valleys to it. The stuff that led up to Flair using a chair on Luger's knee when JJ had Young distracted. I mean, that was basically the pivot point of the match. And the other thing I'll credit Luger for, the guy had amazing cardio for one. But when you see him selling in that figure four, and you see the anguish on his face when he's dripping sweat, and that's the kind of raw emotion that so many guys miss in today's business. The kind of thing where you watch as a fan and you're like, I believe that guy knows what real physical pain feels like. So after Flair spent several minutes targeting Luger's knee and doing everything to further damage the cartilage, Luger digs down deep and tries to rally one final comeback. He gets Flair up in the rack momentarily, but the leg buckles from under him. Flair falls on top. You get the great visual where Tommy goes to count Luger's shoulders down, but he's in perfect position to where he doesn't see Flair using the ropes for leverage. 1, 2, 3. Flair retains. And albeit, I think a lot of people in the venue were disappointed to not see Luger come out on top. Not really what you would call despicable heat, just disappointment. And we've talked, or should I say, I've talked plenty about the way Luger's been fucked around with world title matches over the years. Like the funny thing here, JR says, I guarantee you that one day, Luger will finally fulfill his dream of becoming world heavyweight champion. And I'm just like, well, he's right. You're just going to be waiting another 10 goddamn years for it to happen. And yes, while I know he does technically become the world champion in 91, if you know anything about that actual title run, you wouldn't necessarily call it a stellar title reign. I mean, for half the fucking title run, he wasn't even holding the real world's title. Because that's when Flair walked out with the belt after the blow-up with Jim Herd. So, I mean, yeah, he was world champion on paper before the late 90s. But in terms of him holding the real physical gold belt and earning that crowning achievement the right way, talked about it before. What year was it? Was it 97 or 98 when that finally happens? When he pins Hogan. It was sometime during the height of the Monday Night Wars. Now, of course, Luger does go on to eventually win the U.S. heavyweight title in 89. So it's not like he totally fell off the map of relevancy. It just goes back to everything I said about them missing the boat at the Bash. And I didn't really expect them to shift gears and put the belt on Luger here. I don't think it would have made a whole lot of sense. Plus, I don't think the crowd was really clamoring for it like they were in Baltimore. So the timing would have been off. And the other thing, too, from a booking standpoint, they were getting ready to bring in Steamboat to work the program with Flair at the Chi-Town Rumble. So you just couldn't put the belt on Luger here. There was no way you could make it work. It's a very strange pay-per-view going back and watching again. Some good stuff, some not so good stuff. The biggest standout to me, though, is looking at all these lists of names that are just not around through much of 89. Guys who were literally wrestling on this card. Look at some of the roster. The Fantastics, they're pretty much done with WCW by February or March. Dennis and Randy are both gone by February after the disagreements with Crockett. Ivan Koloff's done. The Russian Assassins and Paul Jones, I think that group is disbanded by February or maybe even January. And I think all three of them go away afterwards. Paul Jones for sure. Yeah, Jack Victory may have stuck around to do some underneath stuff. Actually, yeah, of course. He ends up subbing for Condrey at the Chi-Town Rumble when they booked the loser leaves town match between the Midnights and the original Midnights, because Dennis no-showed the pay-per-view. JYD's out within the first month or two of 89. Barry Windham and JJ are gone pretty soon. Bam Bam, same thing. Dusty, we all know about that situation. Like, what is that, 50% of the card? And it's why I refer to the Starrcade event as a true end of an era. It's the sunset ride-off for a lot of these previous Crockett regime members. And we are about to get an influx of newer guys making their debuts under the Turner banner, some of which worked out more favorably than others. And while you still had guys like Flair and Luger and Sting and the Midnights around, oh God, the booking. The booking is about to become astronomically bad. And that all preceded George Scott coming in as part of the committee. If you're looking forward to fun, entertaining rants about terrible booking over the next few months, like AEW level ranting, you're going to want to come back and check out my WCW 89 reviews. Because it is about to get very bad. You know what isn't bad, though? Midsouth television. It's actually going in the polar opposite direction of where WCW is about to head over the next several months. Granted, we're also talking about a 5-year time gap. But as we close out the year 1983 over these next couple weeks, I'm sure either next week or the week after, they'll probably be re-airing some highlighted footage to reflect back on what we saw throughout the year. And over the last month, show's primarily been centered around the Russians. In addition to them building up Nikolai as one of the top regional heels, they also turned Crusher Darso heel and made him a Russian adversary. So those two are currently tangled up with Hacksaw Duggan and JYD in the main events. And likewise, they got Magnum TA and Wrestling 2 in the tag division, and that's all really starting to take off. They actually aired a pre-tape at the top of the show where we saw both guys in training. And it was funny, because JR's supposed to be inside what he claims to be a gym. And let me just say this up front. I have been to plenty of gyms in my life. Never in my entire life have I been to a gym where they had a giant dead shark mounted on the wall. I would probably venture a guess is to say they were in Wrestling 2's humble abode, aka his basement. But he had some workout equipment down there. He was mainly trying to work on Magnum's lower body, since the lower body is often neglected in the training regimens. I mean, there is a reason gym rats joke about skipping leg day. It's, I do leg day twice a week, and it never doesn't suck. It does not get easier. Of course, then again, I also don't run 2-mile marathons in the freezing cold like apparently Magnum and 2 did before this workout. That's, got to be brutal on the body. It was nice to see a wrestling segment where training was emphasized in a positive light. I know for a lot of the boys today, going to the gym is not necessarily everybody's favorite pastime. Especially when you look at the state of some of these AEW numbnuts. But this all tied in with the opening bout. Wrestling 2 worked with Larry Higgins in the opener, and Magnum TA was on commentary with JR to talk about his working relationship with 2. It was weird, though, because Bill Watts at the top of the show claimed that Boyd Pierce was on a well-earned vacation with his family. Meanwhile, who was the ring announcer this week? Not Reeser Bowden. It was Boyd. I mean, I know they're supposed to tape all this stuff out of order, but a little bit of inconsistency with the formatting there. Must have been a rotten vacation for Boyd. In terms of what Magnum covered, the thing he mainly stressed was that the more time he spends with Wrestling 2 in the gym or watching tape, the more he comes to enjoy his time working with them. Because with every experience, he's always learning something new. Keep in mind, too, when we were talking about a guy like Magnum, he was not the most blaring personality on camera, but he always had a presence about him that resonated with the people. That's how he grew to become a big star in Crockett over the next couple years. You know, and when he's sitting there talking about how much he's already learned under Wrestling 2's guidance, nothing about it comes across phony. You could tell these guys had a really good working relationship together. And while we've seen Wrestling 2 get on Magnum's case, it's not coming from a place of spite. It's that old school mindset of being up front to tell Magnum like it is. If he screws something up, he's going to let him have it. Tough love, as the old saying goes. So 2 went over with the knee lift here. Very simple get-over match. But having Magnum on the headset added good flavor. Then when we come back, We go straight to the ring for one of the more heavily promoted matches from the end of last week's program. Crusher Darso going up against Hacksaw Duggan. And we saw Nikolai and Duggan the previous week, which ended in controversial fashion. We'll talk about the match in a sec. First, I have to point out, and how's this for covert foreshadowing for future commentary teams? Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler on the headset together. A lot of post-Attitude Era fans grew up watching JR and Lawler paired together on Monday Night Raw. Well, here they were 20 years prior on Mid-South television. And they had natural chemistry going back then. I actually kind of like Lawler as a commentator here. He wasn't annoying or detracting from what was going on in the ring. I think this was back before he took the heel personality too far. I did laugh at the point where he talked about Mid-South fans waving the, quote, American fags. And in realizing that he fucked up, he tried to slip in the word flag immediately afterwards. Too little, too late. In terms of the action, a lot of it is just standard back and forth slugfest stuff until they get to the big hot angle at the end. After Johnny Martinez gets bumped to the floor, the Russians pulled a little twin magic where Nikolai pulled Darso out of the ring, and he goes to cover Duggan, making sure to shield his face so Martinez couldn't see as he climbed back in to count the three. And of course, as the Russians are trying to celebrate their bogus win, here comes Magnum TA running down to inform Martinez about the wrong guy getting pinned. He also had Pee Wee Anderson out there to be the second-hand official. And to use JR's exact terminology, this is when things broke down into a Pier 6 brawl. You had Hacksaw rejoining the fight to go after Magnum, but he gets thwarted in his efforts. Jim Neidhart's out there trying to go after Magnum. That's when a bunch of the babyface locker room empties out and sends the heels powdering, including Rick Rude, who was wearing nothing but his underwear. I'm sure the horny ladies love that visual. Now, of course, Reed and Neidhart technically leave alongside the Russians here, not necessarily because they agree on political philosophy. More so is because Reed and Neidhart had their ongoing issues with Magnum in wrestling too, so they tried to seize on an opportunity to attack Magnum when he was vulnerable. But, and in no way implies the heels are all working hand in hand. But it was a good little brawl. Crowd was going apeshit for it. Again, it's another match where the wrestling action is kind of subordinate to all the stuff that happens after the fact. Same thing that happened last week when Duggan wrestled Volkov. But they're still keeping heat on the Russians, which is exactly what they need to be doing. So it all worked. As did the Midnight Express in their get-over match with Mike Jackson and Coco Ware. Coco Ware? Yes. He's where? He's there. Who? Coco Ware. Where? God, it's like an Abbott and Costello sketch. Who's on first, what's on second, and I don't know who's on third. Speaking of gags and guys ribbing each other, when JC took the mic from Boyd and made fun of his suit, asking if the guy that fitted for him couldn't guess his weight, the look on Boyd's face as he's just glaring a hole right through Corny's little peanut head. God, it was one of the best on-screen moments in Mid-South in all of '83. He just death stared this motherfucker right into the ground. It was awesome. Never took his eyes off him. This also marked the first match with the new version of the Midnight Express where we got to hear Jim Cornette do long-form commentary. Over the last few weeks, it's been primarily ring intros, but because JR didn't have a color guy with him this week, that meant that they had various guys tagging in and out throughout the taping block. So this is JC's opportunity to really sit down and put over Eaton and Condrey, establish what kind of team they are, why they're going to be successful, what their goals are. And he did a phenomenal job. It was peak Jim Cornette witty banter at its finest. Probably the singular moment where a light bulb went off and Watts realized, we ought to get this guy talking more frequently on television. Because he's a brilliant heat magnet. Especially listening to JC poke fun at Coco Ware in this match. He had me dying at certain points. Talking about how Coco just got out of a settlement where he sued his lower body for non-support. I've heard that one a time or two over the years on his podcasts. But of course, everything Cornette talks about here is off the cuff. I mean, he may have wrote down a few quips down on a piece of paper to keep in his back pocket, but most of this shit, he's just coming off the top of his head. But that's what makes it so natural. Kind of goes back to what I said in the Wrestling 2 match. Just having Cornette out there to be a mouthpiece and put over his boys. It took a regular TV squash and made it 10 times better. Just by having him out there to talk about Eaton and Condrey's attributes. Being a heel manager and taking shots at the opposition. It was good stuff. And the Midnights went over with their assisted Doomsday finish. They continue to get more and more over as scumbag heels every week. So they're doing all the right things with them. It's only a matter of time before their popularity blows up. And we're constantly referring to a lot of the roster changeover happening between 83 and 84. Specifically, the emphasis on a lot of the more athletic, smaller guys. Watts was starting to move in more of that direction. Bringing in talents throughout the area that weren't necessarily the biggest of guys. Midnight Express, Lanny, Poffo. And soon to be added to that list of names, the addition of Terry Taylor. He's going to be showing up in a couple weeks to make his Mid-South debut. And it's another name that you would not really consider a remarkably big athlete. Definitely not a Steve Williams or a Hacksaw Duggan size guy. At the same time, he ends up being one of the more heavily featured stars throughout 84 and 85. If I remember right, I think he ends up becoming a key part to that TV championship tournament they're about to unveil in the coming months. So they pieced together a little promo package to show some of his work in places like Memphis, and I think there may have been some Carolina footage in there as well. Just a simple highlight reel. I wasn't really sold on the dubbed-in music they had for this thing. I mean, I know it was canned. I don't really even know what you would call that genre. Indie rock? Whatever it was not very befitting of something you'd commonly hear in the South circa 1983. But, that's another big name to look forward to over the next couple weeks. Terry Taylor, the Red Rooster. And I immediately just ruined the people's excitement. The mere mention of the gimmick. God. Thanks for that one, Vince. Then we had Lanny, Poffo, and the Iceman going up against the Mid-South Tag Team Champions Butch Reed and Jim Neidhart. What wound up being the TV main event. I think this is supposed to be non-title. Not really sure. Because of the Can Network music, they had to replace We Are Family. Couldn't really hear boys' ring intros. And for a makeshift babyface tag team that they basically threw together with 1 week's build, to me it kind of looked like they were trying to get over Lanny and the Iceman as the next top babyface tag team. It was a great match. Don't get me wrong. I was just left scratching my head thinking, did I completely forget about the Lanny Poffo King Parsons babyface run in Mid-South? The fact that they basically took the tag team champions to the limit in their first ever match as a team. And they gave us a lot of time, too. It actually ran through a commercial spot, which we really didn't see all that frequently in Mid-South. As you're watching the Iceman and Lanny stay alive and hold their ground against the champions, kind of gets to a point where as you're watching the match unfold, you start thinking, Christ, they can't keep these guys down to save their lives. And it all leads to the big angle where they get the Iceman down on the floor while Alfred Neely's busy trying to keep Neidhart in the ring. Butch Reed rams the Iceman into the ring post, so he comes up gushing blood from his head, sounding like he'd just been hit over the head with a frying pan. And it leads to a really interesting situation where I can't remember which referee it was. I think it was Randy Anderson. But he comes down and sees the Iceman bleeding. So rather him call for the match to be stopped while they attend to the Iceman, one of the more oddly humorous moments we've seen on Mid-South television recently, the match continues as Anderson helps the Iceman to the back so they can patch up his head wound. And meanwhile, poor Lanny Poffo's in there basically having to fend for himself in a 2-on-1 handicap situation. Even JR and Lawler at one point were like, shouldn't the match be stopped? This is kind of an unfair scenario for Lanny Poffo at the moment. But again, it told the rest of the story of the match where Lanny's trying to keep the match going and continue to fight back. And eventually the Iceman hits the ring a house ablaze. Now he's got the giant bandage taped around his head like a bandana. And he just gets in there and starts throwing soup bones with both heels. And eventually it just kind of breaks down, so Neely has to call for the bell and declare it a double DQ. I liked it. There was sure a lot going on, but the angle with the Iceman kept things really intriguing. I couldn't get over the funny visual of them pulling the Iceman away to attend to him. Yet they were perfectly willing to let Lanny fight for himself at a 2-on-1 disadvantage. I didn't realize the Poffos had that much heat with the locker room. But it was still a fun TV main event. And, hell of a showcase for a completely short-term tag team that I'm pretty sure doesn't go anywhere. But now I kind of want to see Lanny and the Iceman get a title shot. This time with a decisive finish. You know, I think overall, there was still plenty to like about the show. I wouldn't say it was the most exhilarating program from start to finish, but I like the fluctuating color commentators. I mean, if anything, it kind of proved just how well Jim Ross gelled with any combination of people he worked with. Be it the managers or the wrestlers, babyface or heel. And while it was kind of strange to see Watts being taped in an obviously separate segment, yet they still try to make it seem like he was pitching to the action as it was happening live. I don't know, they still kind of made it work. We'll just overlook the giant gaffe of him claiming Boyd was on vacation when we found out he was the ring announcer for this taping block. You can't win them all. Okay. So last episode of World Class in 1985. And here's to another banner stellar year of World Class Championship Wrestling television programming. I say that with the utmost enthusiasm. Not a shred of frivolity in that statement. Now, technically, this was the week they taped the Christmas Star Wars special. But as we know with the tape delay schedule, it usually takes an additional week for them to start airing the footage. So we kind of had another one of those run-of-the-mill world-class episodes to close out the year. How run-of-the-mill are we talking? The opener was Dave Peterson versus Jack Victory. So yes, very run-of-the-mill. I know that immediately seems like I'm shitting all over Jack Victory. I'm really not. Victory's a solid hand to have on the roster. He's not a handsome Jimmy Valiant in terms of off-the-wall personality. Quite frankly, nobody was like handsome Jimmy. So that's not even a fair comparison. I think I pointed this out the other week. There were a lot of empty bleachers in the Sportatorium for this taping block. Again, holiday season. You have to take that into account. But as we'll see in the year 1986, those empty seats are about to become a lot more commonplace. Especially for the big shows. The work here was all right. Victory's good at getting a reaction out of the crowd by lying about hair pulling spots and things that the babyface clearly wasn't doing. But he's just trying to ruffle some feathers to work the crowd. But they went back and forth. Some quick pinfall covers toward the end. And then Jack stacked up Dave Peterson and kind of looked like he pinned him clean. I didn't notice any visible tight pulling or anything. I like how I automatically assumed that just because he's a heel, he would have had to have cheated to win. Against Dave Peterson, of all people. Whatever. I had nothing else to add about it. Nor did I have anything to add about this grappler interview. It was a good promo, all things considered. I actually kind of forgot that Len Denton could cut a decent promo. And I am glad they at least drew attention to last week when we just randomly saw the grappler show up with the Texas Heavyweight title. I was like, okay, when in the hell did he become the new Texas Heavyweight champion? When we literally just saw Brian Diaz defend the fucking thing not less than a week prior. Oh, they did a rapid-fire title switch in one of the venues. Probably Fort Worth. And the whole story here was that the grappler apparently used his gimmick boot to score the victory. His claim is that it's an orthopedic boot. Totally not loaded. And of course, he's getting all defensive that Bill Mercer is asking him questions about it. I did laugh at his quote here. "I'm a handicap. That is why he specifically wrestles with the specially made boot. Because he's handicapped." Like I said, really solid Heat promo. And it's not like they haven't been drawing attention to the boot before. Mercer talked about it when the grappler made his TV debut. But he has wrestled plenty of matches since that point, and nobody called anything into question then. He wasn't really using the boot illegally. But now apparently it's an issue because he did something controversial in a match for the Texas Heavyweight title, which, by the way, we still have not seen air. So they mentioned a controversy and then did not bother to explain what the controversy was. Minute details. It did make his match with the Iceman a lot more intriguing, though, because now we're kind of waiting around to see what's going on with the grappler's left boot. They did a close-up of it at one point, and I just kind of sat there saying to myself, yep, it is definitely a boot. Nothing about it looks all that suspect. I was expecting to see, small little cleats on the bottom of the sole. Because then we can have a strong debate about the controversial use of a boot. But they had a pretty basic match. And, well, just to kind of skip ahead to the shit that actually matters here. After they just established the story in the previous pre-tape that nobody is capable of pinning the grappler, well, then the Iceman pins the grappler. And then he got on the house mic, and he demanded a rematch because he claims his shoulder was up approximately 4 inches off the mat when he was getting pinned, which is the best heel line I've ever heard. 4 inches. He measured it in real time. So the Iceman comes back and starts going blow for blow with the grappler. Bronco Lubitsch is trying to wave it off and get the Iceman to back out of the corner. And this is the part I was trying to figure out here, because I watched it back like 3 times. I couldn't figure out if the grappler just fucked up or if I misunderstood which boot was supposed to be the gimmicked one. We see the grappler loading the boot in the corner, aka the thing where you see the heel stomp his foot on the mat several times, giving the impression he's trying to move some type of weapon into position or something. So he does this with his left foot, but then he charges at the Iceman and kicks him with his right foot. I was very confused. I'm like, wait, so which boot is the loaded boot? How do you load your left boot, but then kick the guy and hurt him with your right boot? Unless I am totally out to lunch on something. But I've watched wrestling long enough to know when somebody fucks up. I think Len Denton fucked up. He had one job. All he had to do was basic math. He had a 50-50 shot to get it right, and he failed. Aside from that major oversight, the rest of the segment was fine. I'm immediately more intrigued to see the grappler as a Texas heavyweight champion than I am boring Brian Diaz. So I'll take it. At least it's a semi-interesting storyline. Then we came back to catch the replay of last week's main event. And remember, the big story at the end of last week's episode was the supposed missing link face turn, as well as him scooping up Sunshine and carrying her to the back to do God knows what with her. She didn't seem to object to the kidnapping at the time. I should probably fill in some blanks here, too, in case you missed it. The missing link was for a very brief window an honorary member of Percy Pringle's dynasty. They've been showing signs of dissension in the previous television matches. So at the end of this tag match with Kabuki and Link versus Scott Casey and the Iceman, Kabuki grabbed a hold of Sunshine and basically did as much violence to her as what could be tolerated on television. And the missing link saw this and came to the defense of my lady. He's also supposedly broken away from Percy's group. So he is in essence a babyface now. This is how far we've come with world class as we move into 1986. Somebody woke up one day and figured, let's turn the missing link babyface. Let's show that he has a soft spot for the ladies. And while the crowd popped for him when he showed up and attacked Kabuki and Pringle, they didn't necessarily pop for him picking up Sunshine and carrying her to Narnia. And we're apparently going to have to wait a bit longer to see exactly what happened. We can at least confirm with Sunshine, she's not dead. The missing link did not eat her. So that's good news. But for the actual TV main event, We had Kerry Von Erich versus Rick Rude. And it was an American heavyweight title match. You could also call this one the Battle of the Physiques. Who had the better body? Kerry or Rick? Well, the people pop more for Kerry, but I still think Rick Rude had the better bod. He had more abs. Although, to be fair, Kerry had broader shoulders. It was a pretty competitive pose down. I think maybe we ought to get Big Papa Pump in there to be the final verdict. We all know Scotty Steiner's the king of pose downs. So yeah, Kerry Von Erich and Rick Rude. This was a total WWF match circa the late 80s, minus the bad gimmicks. I can just see Vince McMahon sitting there next to Bill Mercer getting a hard-on for all the tests of strength going on in this match. The muscularity would have been too much for that man to handle. Seriously, that's what 90% of this match was. It was Rick Rude challenging Kerry to a test of strength, which, again, the crowd went nuts for it. I mean, they got to see Kerry flex his back and shoulder muscles. Who the hell wasn't going to pop for that? And it did eventually turn into a wrestling match. Rude worked over Kerry's right knee after he missed a charge at one point. Percy was great calling all the heat spots on the floor. I did kind of roll my eyes when Kerry just completely started no-selling the knee during his comeback. That was annoying. Never claimed Kerry was one of the better workers in the business. But you get to the end where they do the double bonk spot. Kerry eventually gets Rude in a pinning predicament near the ropes, but Percy helps drag Rude's foot over the bottom rope. And you see David Manning initially count the 3, but waves it off when he sees Rude's foot. But Kerry hears the hand come down to count the third fall and figures he won. So while Kerry's turn to Rude celebrating, Rude spins him around and plants him with the Rude Awakening. 1, 2, 3. Nothing fancy. Nothing overly intricate. Just a good old-fashioned heel recovery during a false victory celebration. I actually kind of like the dynamics of Rude working with the Von Erichs. It's a newer, fresher match we haven't already seen 100,000 goddamn times, like we have with Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez. I mean, I love those guys, but it's the Freebird principle. Seen it, done it. It's kind of old news. At least the stuff with the Pringle Dynasty is fresher material. Now, we are still getting the Freebirds and the Von Erichs for the 6-man championships at Christmas Star Wars. They had set that up the previous week when they aired the Freebirds' return at Fort Worth. It is, I believe, the last time we will ever get to see those guys go at it. So if you're somebody that enjoys nostalgia and reliving the glory days of World Class, it'll be a match to check out. I know I was kind of down on it when I was discussing the background because, I mean, I've seen the match so many fucking times now. But in all fairness, it has been a while. And Terry Gordy's made a couple appearances over the last year. But all 3 of the Freebirds, for the most part, have not been active in the Dallas area for a very long time. And you still have people that clamor to see the match, even after 2 years of beating that freaking program into the ground. But it goes to show just how timeless it was. But that'll be the next couple weeks of Dallas programming, is them replaying the Star Wars footage from Christmas Day. And that is going to wrap up this podcast here. So, folks, thanks for checking this one out. And again, this is going to be the final review series for the year 2024. So make sure you stop back on Monday when you get our 2024 podcast, where we go back and cover the good and bad and the ugly of wrestling this year. And I'll also make sure I give you my top 10 matches. It'll be a fun podcast. But I'll catch you guys next week, and take care for now. Peace out.